Schmuckler sitting here as the sun sets slowly in the west. The last video of this day to deliver what is probably the foundational idea of the integrated picture that I've been developing. It starts for me in 1970 when I see something that's important that I'll try to convey here in somewhat brief fashion. I find that I want to complete the picture that I've been laying out today in pieces, but my stamina is flagging. I'll lay it out in a somewhat quick fashion, but in the description you'll find with the YouTube video of this, I will provide some links to if you want to see whether some of the more elaborate ways of showing the truth of this. I say that it is inevitable and that any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos, that steps onto the path of civilization will inevitably be condemned to deal with a destructive force that drives the evolution of its civilization in ways that it would not have chosen, but could not avoid because it was an inevitable dynamic that in the a systemic force that would arise as a result of this civilizational process. Now, I've started out today talking about how liberal America failed to recognize essentially a coherent force that was consistently making the human world worse, arising on the political right. And I say that definition, I like calling it evil. I think it fits, but it doesn't have to be called that, but it exists. And I try to say that we're paying a huge price for liberal Americas not having seen what was taking over the Republican Party and not having fought it, allowing it to get more and more powerful until the unthinkable happens, like this election. And I've said that the reason they didn't see it was because most of liberal America operates in a secular worldview. And the secular worldview didn't provide any kind of means of comprehending the reality of such a thing as a coherent force, et cetera, et cetera. And I said that that was more or less understandable in terms of the religious traditions seem to have been aware of something out there, which I'm showing from a secular point of view is a reality and a fundamental reality of two coherent forces battling over human destiny. As a result of not seeing it, they didn't fight it. And as a result of their not fighting it, it got more and more powerful. As a result of that imbalance of power, the extraordinary thing that happened was that the American electorate had gotten moved to a very broken place where such a choice was possible, even though Donald Trump is probably as thoroughgoingly wrong to give the presidency's powers to as one could easily design. So I argued that it's important that we flesh out the secular worldview, which understandably emerged, I don't know, in recent generations as a predominant place where there wasn't a means of conceiving how there might be such a coherent force, therefore didn't perceive it, therefore didn't fight it, therefore allowed it to get powerful, therefore allowed it to inflict this catastrophe on the country. And then I thought, I tried to indicate that this kind of evil, if I like to call it, because I think we relate to evil appropriately. We want to fight and keep it from controlling our world. That this evil was something you could see moving through the human world as the pattern of brokenness gets transmitted through the dense network of cause and effect over time, because brokenness begets brokenness. And you can see that there is a force, which is something that moves something like a ball or whatever. In this case, it's a pattern of brokenness. There's a force operating in the human world that you can see by its effects of transmitting brokenness. And you can see it. I didn't use this line earlier, but it's a favorite line of mine for capturing what does it mean to say you can see a force. And the line I like is, you can see this force the way you can see the wind in the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. It moves the pattern of brokenness through the human world. And I think that I can argue pretty plausibly that that's a major way that the human world works. And then I said, if I could show you that there was an initial impetus of brokenness that gets imparted into the human world with the rise of civilization, I was saying, then I hope that you would be able to say that there is, in fact, a force of brokenness that's at work in the human world. And I think it can be shown that there is. And here I am right now to just sketch out the inevitability of there being that kind of a force, of that impetus of brokenness. And even though I'm going to be rather brief now, I will provide some links, because I'm fatiguing. I'll provide some links to where it can be seen laid out fairly fully. At book length, that's the parable of the tribes back there. It basically elaborates the idea that changed the course of my life. It got me my doctorate in a special program at Berkeley and stuff like that. I mean, it's just, it really set and I think even by itself, it should change the way we understand our circumstance as a species. And here's how it goes. In the biologically evolved order, it's important, I think, to recognize, it's not just individual organisms or species that get selected for, the natural selection at the heart of the idea, the beautiful idea from Darwin. It is a whole system, a natural order. Another favorite line of mine for capturing this is, the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. There's an interdependence that when you select, when the selection process selects for the predator and the prey, another way I have of putting it is that when the wolf falls upon the sheep, it's part of the pattern of survival, not only for the wolves, but for the sheep as well. Because if you get rid of the predator, the sheep become too numerous, they overgraze, and they undermine the foundations of their lives by that overgrazing. So you end up with a system in which, at the micro level, you've got nature red in tooth and claw, but at the macro level, you've got a selection for the kind of synergy that facilitates the perpetuation of the system as a whole. That there is an order that gets selected for that has to do with how predators and prey and primates and parasites and hosts, occasionally things like that life itself doesn't control, like the movement of like ice ages and like the movement of continents can disrupt this order. But fundamentally, the selective process is a selection for essentially the synergies of the biosphere, is the way I'd like to put it. And that developed on this planet, and I'm another topic that I like is the conjecture about what's inevitable wherever that civilization emerges, which I imagine is a lot of places given the billions and trillions of planets there seem to be. That the wherever civilization emerges out of the biological evolutionary process, it will inevitably emerge into a situation that varies in a fundamental way from the order out of which that species was emerging. Human beings were cultural, but still living continuously the way primate bands did, pretty much until 10 or 12,000 years ago. A hunting-gathering society and a primate band that we used to be further back, 6 or 7 million years ago, we split off from the chimpanzees. They're basically living in terms of size and structure and means of subsistence and in a way that's continuous with the niche in which they evolved biologically. But when you get a creature like human Homo sapiens that's got the intellectual creativity, a kind of intelligence that wasn't there before, but enables them to change the rules so that they can pull themselves out of the order they used to be in, we move from one kind of system, which is ordered, to another kind of system, which is disordered, because there has been nothing prepared by the natural selection and nothing that can be put into the system by the creature itself from the beginning, because there are all these different societies that are interacting with each other. Even though lions and zebras are interacting with each other in a way that's within an overarching order, a natural order. The civilized societies that have broken out of that order, they're fragmented. They can't institute anything that says, okay, well, here are the rules, and make sure that the way these societies interact will be, according to Hoyle, kosher, whatever you want to put it, will be conducive to the overall system. It's an anarchic situation. That's the key. The breakthrough into civilization, with civilized societies having to interact with each other outside of any order, means that they're in an anarchic situation. And then I turn to the British philosopher of anarchy, Thomas Hobbes of the 17th century, who said that the inevitable consequence of anarchy is a war of all against all. And we've seen that in the world around us in our time. When the order breaks down, gangsters rise to the top. It's through history. And that book back there is a lot about what that means. A war of all against all generates a different kind of selective process, because only those, it appears at the beginning that, oh, this species has just broken through into all this new kind of freedom. Oh, wow, they can go in any direction they want. Would that it were so. Inevitably, there is going to be a war of all against all. And inevitably, that means that only those that prevail in a war of all against all can survive and spread with their cultural ways. All that cultural differences, it turns out that only a certain slice of them are viable for the long haul. Because no matter how wonderful you are in other respects, if you can't deal with the war of all against all, you're going to be eliminated. And that book elaborates on that a whole lot. There's a selective process for the ways of power, inevitably. That's why I say that any creature on any planet that takes that step is going to inevitably descend into anarchy, because there's no other way it can be. And out of that anarchy, there's inevitably a war of all against all. That means inevitably there's going to be a selection for whatever those cultural ways are that that confer the kind of power you need to survive in that kind of anarchic world. And that's very non-random. And I go into all the different dimensions of a society that relate to whether it survives in a war of all against all. Like World War II was a GNP, they called it back then, a GDP now, a GDP war. And, so it's not just it's technology, it's economy, it's the political structure, it's the way kids get socialized. All these things get selected for if you've got generation after generation, century after century, through the millennia, of a process whereby only the anarchic nature of the intersocietal system generates a selective force that mandates that civilization will necessarily evolve in certain directions. So you can see that wherever civilization emerged in pristine form, and there are half dozen places, 4 in the old world and 2 in the new world. In every case, there's a basically parallel process where things emerge in which you end up with usually something pretty ugly. The selection for the ways of power result, with the emergence of empires, with tyrants ruling over, war-making societies in which the majority of people are subjugated, enslaved even. I mean, you can that book again, documents a whole lot of what the historical record shows about the selection for the ways of power, inevitable, and not as a function of human nature. Which is why when I'm talking about evil, I am not talking about us being in fun, that within our nature there's evil. I'll leave aside the question of what all is there in our nature. That's something I'm happy to address. All I claim is I can prove that we are better creatures than history makes us look because of this systemic force that's consistently selecting for the way I call it, the spirit of the gangster, giving the spirit of the gangster a disproportionate say in how the world is going to be run. That's an inevitable part of what happens if a creature invents its own way of life and unleashes a force it couldn't envision and never could control until we're moving into the direction where we're either going to bring it under control or we're going to destroy ourselves. So that's the original impetus. The impetus of brokenness that leads to the brokenness begets brokenness and on through history. I document, not only in that book, The Parable of Tribes, which I should probably show you. Let me see if I can find these things. I had trouble figuring out how this works. So let me that's the book where I make the case that it is an inevitable result of the breakthrough into civilization. We've known about evolution for more than a century and a half, but I think nobody seems, as far as I can tell, has paid enough attention to the ramifications of an unprecedented kind of step onto the path of civilization, where natural selection is no longer determining the nature of the life form, a new kind of life form that's the result of the creative imagination of the creature. It's a tragedy. We're in a sense for our own. So we're punished for our strength, which is sort of why it's a tragedy. The tragic hero often pays a price for what, from another perspective, look like their greatest gifts, like Hercules' strength and such. That's what the tragic hero is often undone by the very thing that makes him admirable and heroic. And here the human species is the smartest bunch ever to emerge in 3.5 billion years of life. And as a result of our smarts, we take a step that nobody else had ever taken. And whoa, boy, it's got ramifications that we haven't looked at, which is that the ways of power become mandatory. And this is a book that I wrote after A Parable of Tribes, published by Bantam Books, 1988, I think it was. And it traces a lot of the brokenness begets brokenness. And there are two different dimensions to this, sort of the beginning of my thinking about that weaving. Okay, you got a civilized world in which there's going to be war of all against all. Well, that all by itself. That also means that there's all the cities that get put to the sword, all the people that get enslaved and all that stuff. That's going to be brokenness imparting a lot of brokenness. Out of the brokenness of anarchy, the lack of a good order, which is inevitable with civilization's emergence, out of that brokenness comes the brokenness of the the traumas of war. People get broken. I mean, you can see it. I mean, what's happening in Gaza, what happened to, if to understand why people get this broken, like in a place like Israel versus Hamas, both sides, there's brokenness that got broken by a world in which power has not been well controlled. But there's a second way in which there's an inevitability to the impetus of brokenness that gets started right away. In addition to the traumas of living in a world where there's nothing to hold an imperialist expansionist power in check if it wants to do what Putin's doing to Ukraine. In addition to that, there's a selective process whereby the civilized societies that are surviving are being shaped by the selection for power. That has not this very far from being the same thing as selecting for what will best meet human needs. So you've got people being born into societies that have been shaped by the selection for power, and they're having to fit into them. And the demands that those societies make have to do with internalizing a kind of set of demands, morality or whatever, that are not necessarily friendly to the genuine needs of a human being. And that's another sort of brokenness. And you can see that throughout the history of civilization in one place or another. I mean, just consider the way that, say, sexuality has been dealt with in Western civilization at various junctures, where the demands of the society are hostile to the human creature. And that's inevitable. That's inevitable so long as it's not human choice, but the systemic force that inevitably arises that's dictating. And of course, it's both. It's both. But I think that it can be pretty well demonstrated. Let's see if I can find a way to turn this off. I think it can be pretty well demonstrated. Well, I used to know how to do this. Well, I'll just delete this thing. All right, well, I'll just stand here. It can be pretty well demonstrated that the result of stepping onto the path of civilization is that regardless of the creature's nature, some of the worst of its potentialities are going to be selected for. A cultural creature, which any such creature on any planet would be, has the capacity to be shaped in a whole variety of ways. And if you've got a selective force operating inevitably because of the war of all against all and the lack of control of power, then you're going to get a selection for some of the worst of that creature's potentialities. Which is why, if you look at who on this planet is exerting having the biggest impact, the list would surely include Putin. It would surely include Trump. It would surely, I'm afraid, also include Netanyahu. This is not a random sampling of people. That's why it can be readily shown that inevitably the civilization-creating animal will unfold an ugly history, and that the ugliness of that history is not human nature writ large. It's got to do with the inevitable unleashing of a destructive force. What we've been through just now in America is part of a millennia-long struggle between two coherent forces. In America, in our times, for some reasons that discussed in the previous thing, we've become especially vulnerable to a destructive force arising. I noted two things. One was the changes in technology fortified the ability of the lie to defeat the truth. And I also indicated that a rise of a secular worldview that didn't have a way of understanding the battle between good and evil made our society vulnerable to the rise of a fascist power, because the immune system that should have recognized and fought against that force of brokenness couldn't, had no way of conceiving it. So my contribution that I think could be useful, even after we've lost this terrible, catastrophic defeat, I think it could be useful in helping us know what we're up against, which is the title of that book to my other side, destructive force at work in our world and how we can defeat it, which I wrote and published in 2015 before Trump stepped out onto the stage. I think it can be useful. It certainly would have been more useful in helping liberal America see what was arising upon us. But in any event, what we're dealing with now is an ancient struggle of human beings to get control of something that inevitably was going to begin to be out of control. And if we can't bring that force under control soon enough, well enough, we're going to destroy ourselves, either through nuclear war, which is one manifestation of brokenness, or through the destruction of the biospheric order that we depend on with climate, for example, for our own survival. This is the nature of the challenge that we face as a species. It would be faced by any creature on any planet that it broke out of the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life. It would inevitably be condemned to have a battle between good and evil, not like it's shown in the book of Genesis, but how we can conceive of it in purely naturalistic terms, by looking at the logic of what it means to break out of the natural order into the anarchy of an interactive society, of civilized society, the interactive system of civilized societies that are having to deal with each other in an anarchic situation, which inevitably gives the spirit of the gangster, a very ugly thing that we can see operating in our world, in Ukraine, in the United States, in the Middle East, a disproportionate say. If we want to defeat this destructive force, I think it's imperative that we at least recognize the existence of this force. It's hard to defeat something you can't see. And we in liberal America, with the secular worldview as an unfinished work in progress, have disastrously failed to see it in time, or at least so I fear. Thank you. And if you want to see this laid out in far more, I've got between like 2,500 word version and a book length version of the idea available for you. And I think if you consider the implications of what I think is sort of hard, I haven't found a hole in it. I think it changes your sense of what it means to work for a better world. At least so I have felt for over 50 years. Thank you. Bye-bye. My website, abetterhumanstory.org, and you'll see there, as well as on the description here, ways of exploring this and see for yourself if it isn't a foundational idea that changes how we understand the story of our species and gives us greater insight into what the challenge is that we face.